November 1943, Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, Germany. The gray morning fog drifts low across the test field as a group of Wehrmacht officers gather near a sand berm. Their breath steams in the cold, mingling with cigarette smoke. In front of them, an American weapon captured from North Africa rests on a wooden crate. Painted in chipped olive drab, it looks more like a child's toy than a battlefield threat. Ein Kinderspielzeug, one of the engineers mutters under his breath, a child's toy. Major Franz Müller of the Panzer IV chuckles. The Americans are truly imaginative, he says, smirking as an assistant shoulders the strange tubular launcher. A rocket on a stick. They'll need a miracle to pierce tiger armor with that. The assistant fires. The rocket streaks forward, hissing, trailing smoke, and then strikes a derelict Panzer IV target hull. The explosion dents the steel but fails to penetrate. The officers burst into laughter. This is their secret weapon? Müller says. If this is the best they can do, the Reich has nothing to fear. Around him, notes are taken. Reports will later circulate through German intelligence channels describing the M1 Bazooka as an ineffective, short-range device. The memo concludes that its psychological effect may exceed its actual destructive power. No one pays attention to the young ordnance officer scribbling quietly at the back. His name is Oberleutnant Werner Stahl. Perhaps, he murmurs, we shouldn't laugh too soon. But the laughter drowns him out and echoes over the frozen proving grounds of Kummersdorf. Thousands of miles away, in the laboratories of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, engineers are already working on the next version of the weapon those officers just mocked. They call it the M9 Bazooka, longer, deadlier, and capable of punching through 4 inches of armor. It would not take long before the laughter stopped. Salt spray stings Private Jack Delaney's face as the ramp drops. He's barely 19. The roar of the surf is drowned by machine gun fire, artillery, and the high-pitched scream of mortars. Sand and blood mix underfoot. Bodies fall before they can take 2 steps. Move, move, someone yells. Jack dives behind a twisted beach obstacle, breath hitching. He's soaked, shivering, but he doesn't let go of the long steel tube strapped to his shoulder, the M9 Bazooka. 3 days ago, he had never fired one outside of a dusty field in Devon. Now he's got a 6-pound heat rocket, a shaky trigger finger, and a job. Help punch through Nazi steel. Ahead, 50 yards inland, a Panzer IV churns its treads toward a sand dune, its turret sweeping, searching. The thing's covered in foliage, bark, and mud. Camouflage. The way it moves feels alive. The tank is here to crush the beachhead. Jack's squad leader, Sergeant Bill Kruger, crawls beside him, his helmet bouncing with each thud of nearby explosions. His face is streaked with grime, eyes locked ahead. Delaney, Kruger barks. You wanted your first kill? That's it. That's your shot. Jack nods, hands trembling. He pulls the rocket from the tube sling, locks it into the breech, and shoulders the launcher. The bazooka smells faintly of grease and rust. His cheek presses to the cold steel. Kruger slaps the back of his helmet. Breathe, kid. Wait for the side armor. The tank moves past, exposing its thinner flank. Jack squeezes the trigger. Whoosh! The rocket leaps forward. A trail of white smoke hangs in the air for a breathless second. Then a blinding orange flash rips the tank's side open like a tin can. Flames gush out of the crew hatch. The machine groans to a halt. It worked. Jack drops back, stunned, heart pounding. A U.S. soldier behind him whoops and slaps his back. You just took out a goddamn tank, kid. But there's no time to celebrate. Another shell crashes nearby. They move again, crawling over the dead and past broken hedgehogs. And ahead, more armor waits. Across Omaha and Utah, the M9 Bazooka is no longer a joke. Its cracking panzers open, one close-range ambush at a time, and German officers who had dismissed it as ineffective are about to witness a new nightmare, the infantryman with a rocket on his shoulder. In the shattered bunker above Dog Green sector, Hauptmann Friedrich Stahl, the same young officer from Kummersdorf, watches the scene unfold through a pair of sand-flecked binoculars. His uniform is damp with sweat. A destroyed Panther burns below. Impossible, he whispers, lowering the glasses. His adjutant shakes beside him. They're using something new. It's not Panzerfaust. Not ours. Some kind of American tube. Friedrich nods grimly. The so-called toy just turned one of their best armored vanguards into burning scrap. He reaches for the field phone. This is Stahl. Forward units. Do not underestimate American infantry. Repeat watch for teams with long tubes. They are tank killers. The irony doesn't escape him. Only 7 months ago, the officers had laughed. Now, their elite machines were being picked off by farm boys with shoulder-fired death. He stares out toward the surf, where more Higgins boats unload waves of soldiers, and he wonders how many of them are carrying bazookas. The air smells of burnt oil and blood. The hedgerows here are thick bocage country, a maze of ancient stone walls, tangled roots, and overgrown greenery that turn every field into a fortress. The Germans know it well. They've laid ambushes at every bend, machine gun nests, inside barns, and worst of all, tigers. Sergeant Bill Kruger, now a week into the push towards St. Lo, presses a muddy hand against the dirt wall of a hedgerow and signals for silence. Behind him, Private Delaney clutches his M9 Bazooka like it's part of him now, and maybe it is. His eyes, once wide with terror, are narrowed with focus. Ahead, the distinct clatter of tank tracks grows louder. Not the lighter rumble of a Panzer IV. This one is heavier, deeper. A growl more than a rattle. Kowamudas, Tia. A single Tiger I tank, prowling these roads, can hold up a battalion. Its 88mm gun punches through Shermans like paper. Its armor shrugs off most rounds, but not all. They crouch low as it emerges around the bend yellow-gray camouflage, streaked with streaks of dried blood and soot. The turret swivels, scanning. German infantry follow behind, boots stomping in rhythm, rifles at the ready. Kruger draws a quick diagram in the dirt. 2 shots, one from the flank, one from the rear. Delaney, you're up front. I'll double around. Delaney swallows hard, then nods. He shuffles into position, crawling over roots, thorns snagging at his sleeves. The bazooka feels heavier than usual. His heart pounds like artillery in his chest. The Tiger halts. Its turret slowly begins to rotate toward the hedgerow. Delaney doesn't wait. Foosh! The rocket blasts from the tube, trailing smoke and flame. It slams into the side plate just above the drive wheel. A flash, then nothing. The Tiger rocks, hissing steam, but doesn't stop. Delaney's eyes go wide. The hatch opens, a German tank commander rises, pistol in hand. Just then, from behind, Kruger's second rocket tears into the rear engine grill. Boom! The explosion blossoms into orange fire and thick black smoke. The tank shudders, then belches flame from every seam. German infantry scatter. Some scream. Some throw down rifles and run. A few fire wildly into the hedgerow before they're cut down by the rest of the American squad, now surging forward. Delaney stumbles to his feet, smoke curling around him, ears ringing. He's just helped kill a tiger. Later, when the dust settles, Delaney leans against a stone wall, chewing on a piece of hard bread. Across from him, a war correspondent with a notepad and tired eyes kneels beside the smoldering wreck. Name, the reporter asks. Jack Delaney, private. You just bagged a tiger. Not many can say that. Delaney shrugs, trying to mask the tremble in his fingers. Just did what I was trained to. He looks back at the wreck. The steel monster lies cracked open like a slaughtered beast, its proud black cross now charred and melting. The correspondent squints at the bazooka lying on the ground next to Delaney. That thing? It's real? Oh yeah, Delaney says with a crooked smile. And the Krauts aren't laughing anymore. Across the lines, inside a bunker northeast of St. Lo, General Lieutenant Dietrich Rauch slams a fist onto a table scattered with maps. How the hell are our tanks being destroyed by infantry? A captain stammers. Reports suggest they're using some kind of upgraded rocket launcher, sir. Similar to our Panzerfaust, but longer range, reusable. Then find the source. I want engineers studying the wrecks. I want our tank crews trained to spot these rocket teams. I want snipers targeting anyone with a damn pipe on their back. Yes, Herr General. Rauch exhales through gritted teeth. First, they laughed at the bazooka. Now, they feared it. But the worst part? They had no countermeasure, not yet. Not for a weapon that allowed every American foot soldier to become a tank hunter. The fog is thick over the slopes of Hill 192, a cruel strategic rise east of St. Lo that dominates the countryside like a giant's fist. At 0530 hours, the sound of American artillery thunders across the horizon. The sky flashes orange, then white, then orange again, the light silhouetting broken trees and collapsed stone farmhouses. Private Jack Delaney grips the M9 Bazooka across his chest as if it were a lifeline. His uniform is soaked with morning dew and sweat. His squad is part of the 2nd Infantry Division, and their orders are clear. Take the hill. But Hill 192 isn't just a hill. It's a fortress reinforced by the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division and armored elements from the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. German tanks are dug into the tree lines like metal beasts waiting to pounce. Among them, Tiger I tanks and Panther Aus. G models, some camouflaged, some covered in fresh foliage, some painted with jagged ambush patterns. The American infantry is supported by Shermans. Yes, but everyone knows what happens when Shermans go toe-to-toe with Tigers. They burn, which is why the new doctrine is simple. Let the grunts with the bazookas get close first. By 0645 hours, the men of Able Company are deep in the woods near the southern slope. The air is thick with cordite and mud. Corporal Ray Kinney, a hulking Iowa farm boy with a drawl and a temper, squats next to Delaney, loading a rocket into the bazooka. "We're close," Ray whispers. "I smell diesel." Delaney nods. Sure enough, through the foliage ahead, the dull shape of a Panther materializes, its turret facing away, engine idling low. German voices drift back, laughing about something. Delaney eases forward. 15 yards. 12. He breathes in once. Slow. Controlled. Whoosh. The rocket slams into the rear of the Panther, a blinding flash. The crew doesn't even have time to scream. The back of the turret explodes outward, hurling twisted steel and flames into the air. A second later, smoke erupts from every hatch. The Panther sags in place. "Let's go!" Kinney roars, and the squad surges forward under cover of the blast. Across the hill, another squad isn't so lucky. A Tiger tank, hull down behind a ruined stone wall, opens fire. Its 88mm round slices clean through a Sherman, which detonates in a hellish fireball. The ground shakes. The Americans dive for cover. But one man, Sergeant Clyde Weaver, doesn't flinch. He shoulders his bazooka, covered in soot and ash, and crawls through the smoke and broken branches. The Tiger doesn't see him, not yet. It's too focused on the burning wreck. Clyde rises just enough to steady his aim. 30 feet. Too far for perfect penetration. But he fires anyway. The rocket hits the turret's viewing port and glances off, but the Tiger crew panics. The hatch bursts open and the commander emerges, shouting orders in German, waving for support. Clyde fears again. This time, the rocket slams directly into the hatch and blows the commander off the tank in a flash of fire and bone. The rest of the crew bails out and are cut down by riflemen waiting in the trees. The Tiger doesn't explode, but it dies all the same, abandoned and silent on the bloodied hill. By midday, Hill 192 is in American hands. Bodies litter the slope. German, American, smoking metal, broken trees. A victory, but a bitter one. Over 600 casualties, 5 tanks lost, 2 air support runs canceled due to fog, and yet 5 German tanks destroyed by bazooka teams, 2 Tigers, 3 Panthers, all at under 100 feet. Back at the command post, Colonel Hervey Tribolate of the 38th Infantry Regiment leans over the radio, barking out praise. "Tell division, infantry anti-tank is working. Repeat, bazooka teams are neutralizing heavy armor. We need more launchers, more rockets. Train every squad. Hell, train the cooks if we have to." That night, sitting around a half-dug foxhole on the hillside, Delaney writes in his field journal by the flickering light of a cigarette. "They said we couldn't stop Tigers, that they were invincible. But today we proved that wasn't true. We didn't just survive the hill. We owned it. And the bazooka? That toy rocket just saved all our lives." In the distance, Another tank burns. Darkness covers the Normandy hills like a shroud, pierced only by the occasional flare and the glow of distant fires. The ground is still wet from the evening rain. The smell of damp earth mixes with diesel fumes. The Kampfgruppe from the 2nd SS Panzer Division has begun its desperate counterattack Operation Lüttich, aimed at breaking through to the coast and cutting off Patton's breakout. The sound of tank engines, deep, guttural, relentless, grinds closer. Somewhere in the dark, a Panther rumbles through an apple orchard. Its commander believes surprise is on his side. He's wrong. 100 yards away, lying prone in the wet grass, Sergeant Clyde Weaver waits with his squad. His bazooka rests across his knees like an old hunting rifle. Around him, the men of Fox Company, 30th Infantry Division, are spread out, silent, barely breathing. Weaver lifts his head, listening. The Panther is closer now. Its silhouette emerges against the faint moonlight, barrel scanning left and right. Infantrymen follow in tight formation, disciplined, methodical, unaware. Weaver glances at the man beside him. Private Jimmy Rutledge, 19 years old, Georgia drawl, a baseball card tucked in his helmet band. "You ready?" Weaver whispers. Rutledge swallows. "Let's cook it, Sarge." Weaver shoulders the M9A1. He waits. 40 yards, 35. Thump. The rocket launches like a whip crack in the still air. It hits the Panther just below the turret ring, a golden weak spot. A second later, fire bursts out the side, followed by a secondary explosion as the ammo rack cooks off. The turret lifts an inch before collapsing sideways. The German infantry freeze, then scatter. From the trees, muzzle flashes bloom like fireflies. Fox Company opens up, mowing down stunned attackers. Grenades arc over the hedgerow. The screams begin. In seconds, the ambush is complete. Another tank follows a Tiger, this time its turret turning wildly, blindly, unsure where the shot came from. Weaver rolls behind a hedgerow. "Rutledge, reload." The kid jams another rocket into the tube with shaking hands. Weaver pops up, kneels, fires again. Clang. The rocket hits the Tiger's frontal plate and does nothing. The Tiger sees him now. The 88mm turret swivels toward the hedgerow. Weaver ducks just as the gun fires. The explosion tears open a chunk of earth and vaporizes a sapling. "Circle round," Weaver yells. "Get the side." Rutledge sprints through the orchard, flanking. The Tiger reverses, engine roaring, trying to backtrack out of the kill zone. Too late. Rutledge kneels, takes a deep breath, and fires. The rocket hits the left track. The Tiger lurches, jams, and groans, then dies in place. Its hatch bursts open, and 3 crewmen leap out, only to be cut down by automatic fire from the tree line. By dawn, the fields outside Mortain are littered with broken armor and blackened husks. The 30th Infantry, outnumbered and outgunned, has held the line. The German offensive designed to swing the war back in their favor has stalled, and bazookas played a central role. Over the next 48 hours, 8 tanks fall to infantry ambushes using the M9 and M901. Of those, 3 are Tigers. At a temporary command post set up in a ruined church, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley reads a fresh report by lantern light. His glasses reflect the flickering flame. He murmurs, 8 tanks, all by foot patrols. What was the weapon used? A captain beside him answers, M9 Bazookas, sir. Close-range hits. They're getting real good at it. Bradley sets the paper down. Not bad for a toy. He looks up at the cracked stained glass window above the altar. Its colors are dimmed by soot. But somewhere in the glass, an angel holds a sword. "Send word down the line," he says. "Tell them, the best armor against a Tiger might just be a soldier with a tube and a little courage." Back in the orchard, Sergeant Weaver lights a cigarette with shaking hands. Rutledge is patching up a graze on his leg. "You all right?" Weaver asks. Rutledge shrugs. "Tigers don't scare me anymore," Weaver chuckles. "They should, but they bleed, same as anything else." He lifts his bazooka and rests it against his shoulder. "Long as you aim right." The sun hangs low over the horizon, casting a reddish-orange haze across the narrow roads of the Falaise countryside. Dust rises with every step, thick and acrid from burnt rubber, scorched oil, and something else, the smell of war dying in slow, metallic agony. The Falaise Gap is closing, and tens of thousands of German troops are trapped in a shrinking corridor of death. What was once the proud bulk of the German 7th Army is now a staggering column of desperate men, smashed armor, and limping horses pulling carts. There is no air cover, there is no safe route out, just blood, smoke, and the clank of retreating tanks. And waiting for them are American and Canadian infantrymen with bazookas. Private Jack Delaney walks alongside a hedgerow, eyes scanning the tree line. His boots crunch through broken glass and the twisted remains of a Kubel wagon. The bazooka on his back is scorched black from use, patched with tape, and heavier than it's ever been. He hasn't slept properly in 3 days, but his hands are steady. Beside him, Sergeant Kruger, his old squad leader from Omaha, emerges from a ditch, wiping mud from his face. 2 Panthers up ahead, just past that stone bridge. They're moving slow. Delaney squints. The bridge is partially collapsed, covered in debris. A perfect choke point. "I'll take the left," he says. Kruger nods. "Make it count." Across the field, the 2 Panther tanks lumber forward, part of a last-ditch effort to break out. Their crews are gaunt, soot-covered, eyes wide with exhaustion. The radios inside are filled with desperate voices, some calling for retreat, others still barking orders to push forward. One of the commanders, Oberfeldwebel Karl Brenner, checks his periscope. The road ahead is clear, or seems to be. But then from the side of the road, beneath a wrecked hay cart, a flash of movement. Whoosh! The rocket comes in low, fast, and silent, slamming into the Panther's undercarriage just behind the front wheel. The explosion lifts the entire chassis off the ground. Fuel ignites. The turret spins wildly, then stops. Delaney rolls from cover, already reloading. Behind him, Kruger rises and fires at the second tank. His rocket hits just below the commander's cupola. A fireball erupts skyward, black smoke twisting into the pink evening light. 2 tanks. 30 seconds. No time to breathe. German infantry scatter, some throwing hands up in surrender, others darting into the woods. The road becomes a graveyard of armor. Tigers, Panthers, half-tracks, even bicycles left behind in the dirt. Delaney slumps behind a rock, panting, wiping sweat from his eyes. Across the road, a Canadian tank commander leans out of his Sherman Firefly, scanning the destruction with wide eyes. "Christ almighty," he mutters. "What hit those things?" Delaney lifts the bazooka in one hand, gives a lazy salute. "Just us." By the end of August 17th, the Falaise pocket is sealed. Over 10,000 German soldiers lie dead. More than 350 tanks and armored vehicles are destroyed, many of them not by airstrikes or tank duels, but by infantrymen with bazookas hidden in barns, hedgerows, and roadside ditches. Reports flow back to SHAEF headquarters. One line stands out in the after-action brief. Bazooka teams proved decisive in halting German armor retreating from the pocket. Close-range ambushes accounted for significant tank kills, including multiple Tigers. Recommend wider distribution and training. At a field hospital just outside Trun, Delaney sits on a folding stool, leg bandaged, arm in a sling. He's lucky. Shrapnel nicked his shoulder when one of the Panthers exploded. He refuses evacuation. "I ain't leaving till they're gone," he tells the medic. A photographer from Stars and Stripes snaps his picture, the tired kid with soot on his cheeks, one sleeve ripped off, bazooka leaning against his knee. He doesn't smile. Behind him, a line of wrecked tanks stretches toward the horizon, the metal carcasses of a war machine that once laughed at the idea of a shoulder-fired rocket. Now, the laughter is gone, and the bazooka, once dismissed as a novelty, is feared across every armored regiment left in the Wehrmacht. The ornate wood-paneled war room feels smaller now, tighter not because the walls have changed, but because the truth has. Maps of northern France are sprawled across the central table, covered in red X's. Dozens of German armor divisions once feared across Europe are now reduced to smoldering ruins from Seine to Chambois. Names like Mortagne, Avranches, Saint-Lô, and Falaise have become synonymous with humiliation. General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops, stands with arms folded, eyes locked on a sheet of casualty figures. His uniform is perfectly pressed, but his jaw is tight. "How?" he asks flatly. "How is the U.S. infantry knocking out tigers? Repeatedly, without tank support?" Major Eric Brune, a young intelligence officer from the Abwehr, clears his throat. He looks tired, pale, like he hasn't slept in days. "We've recovered several of the devices, Herr General. Shoulder-fired rocket launchers. The Americans call them bazookas." There's a scoff from the corner. Colonel Hans Richter, a Panzer commander fresh from the Normandy front, leans forward. "I saw it with my own eyes. 2 tigers in my Kampf group, disabled in less than a minute. One was struck in the lower side armor, just below the turret ring. The crew was incinerated. The other had its track blown clean off." He slams a charred steel fragment on the table. "This came from the rocket, it's not a toy." Brun nods solemnly. Their latest version, the M9A1, fires a shaped charge, capable of penetrating up to 4 inches of steel at close range. Guderian doesn't blink. "How close?" "Under 100 meters. Often closer. They're ambushing our armor from hedgerows, barns, sewer grates, even haystacks." Richter adds. "They wait until we pass, then strike from the side or rear. Our vision slits give us no warning. The first we know of it, the turret lifts off the chassis." A thick silence settles. Guderian taps the table once, then again. The only sound in the room. "And we laughed at this?" No one answers. He turns toward the operations map, a swath of the Western Front covered in red arrows pushing eastward. The Americans are at the Seine. Patton is already beyond it. If the bazooka has leveled the playing field for infantry, the implications are grave. Guderian speaks coldly. "Issue a directive to all armored commanders. Bazooka teams must be engaged at all costs. Spotters, snipers, forward infantry. I want them exterminated before they fire." He glares at Brun. "And get me every technical specification on that device. If they can do this to us, I want to know why we didn't do it first." Later that evening, in a narrow side office dimly lit by oil lamps, Major Brun sits alone with a captured bazooka laid across his desk. It's lighter than he expected, elegant even. The trigger is worn smooth. The green paint is flaking. A piece of paper lies beside it, a translated training manual, taken from a dead American sergeant outside Argentan. The last line reads, "A tank is just steel, but steel can't think. You can." Brun stares at the sentence for a long time. The arrogance of American infantry had become deadly. Back on the front lines, Private Jack Delaney kneels in a muddy barn near the Belgian border, whispering to a French farmer's son as he loads a fresh rocket. "See this?" he says, holding up the warhead. "Shaped charge. Burns a hole clean through." The boy's eyes go wide. Delaney grins. "Don't worry, kid. It's not armed." The boy points to the initials carved into the side of the launcher. "JD." "That yours?" Delaney nods. "Saved my life more times than I can count. We're a team now." A voice calls from outside. "Delaney, saddle up. Column moving out." He slings the bazooka over his shoulder, tips his helmet, and strides into the fading evening light. Behind him, the farmer's boy watches as the young American disappears down the dirt road, the silhouette of a man with nothing but a steel tube, heading straight for the machines that once made empires tremble. But no one's laughing anymore. The trees here seem to lean in, watching. Tall firs stretch skyward like frozen fingers, their black trunks slick with rain. The air is cold, damp, and utterly still, broken only by distant shell bursts and the faint buzz of German MG-42s echoing off the ridgelines. The earth is mud and blood and wire. The Hürtgen Forest is not a battlefield. It's a trap, and the Americans are walking straight into it. Private Jack Delaney, now a corporal, moves cautiously along a narrow fire break. His M9A1 Bazooka is slung across his back, wrapped in a poncho to keep the electronics dry. His boots squelch with every step. His squad from the 28th Infantry Division has lost 4 men since dawn. 1 to a mine, another to a tree burst, 2 to an MG nest that seemed to appear from nowhere. And now, somewhere in the trees ahead, A Tiger II, the Königsstiger, the King Tiger, lurks. Its 88mm gun can punch through 3 Shermans at once. Its armor is nearly impervious. And worse, it has already knocked out 3 tanks trying to advance down this sector's main logging road. That's why the infantry are going in. And that's why Delaney is here. Up ahead, through gaps in the trees, the King Tiger sits partially concealed behind a thick log pile covered in pine boughs and coated in camouflage paint. Its turret is motionless, like the eye of a sleeping predator. A forward scout relays the position back to Delaney's squad leader, Sergeant Kruger, now gaunt and grizzled from 5 months of constant fighting. "Delaney," he says, kneeling beside him, "you still got one in the pipe?" "Loaded and ready," Delaney whispers. Kruger points to the ravine that cuts across the slope. "Flank around that gully. Get close, real close. That thing's a monster." Delaney nods, his mouth dry. He adjusts the bazooka strap and starts crawling through brush, so thick it scrapes the skin from his knuckles. Every step forward feels like tempting fate. But this is what it takes. 15 minutes later, Delaney lies in the moss at 20 yards. The Tiger II looms ahead, its steel hull smeared with mud and burn marks. Its side armor is cleaner, maybe replaced after a previous hit. A mechanic is working on something near the left track. A crewman is standing in the open hatch, scanning with binoculars. Delaney raises the bazooka. He aims not for the armor, but the exposed grill over the engine compartment, just visible behind the mechanic. He holds his breath. Whoosh! The rocket cuts the air and smashes into the Tiger's rear. A muffled explosion follows. For a second, nothing. Then smoke. Then fire. The turret jerks. The commander yells something and ducks down. Flames leak out of the engine cover. And suddenly the beast is howling not from a full explosion, but from something worse. A slow burn. The crew starts bailing. One man rolls off the hull. Another climbs halfway through the hatch before the second bazooka round fired by Rutledge from across the gully lands square on the side plate. This time the Tiger erupts. Shrapnel flies. The gun barrel shatters. A wheel bounces into the trees like a piece of toy debris. Delaney ducks. When he looks up again, the Tiger is gone, replaced by a tower of smoke curling into the mist. That night, inside a ruined bunker deep in the forest, an American lieutenant writes a field report under red lamplight. Subject: engagement with German heavy armor in Hürtgen. Observation: M9A1 Bazooka effective against King Tiger at close range when targeting vulnerable points. Notes: use of infantry bazooka teams continues to be one of the only reliable methods of neutralizing heavy tanks in wooded terrain. Recommend further training and distribution. He signs it, folds it, and sends it up the chain. Elsewhere, in a muddy foxhole lit by the occasional flicker of artillery, Delaney shares a tin of coffee with Rutledge, both men wrapped in blankets, faces streaked with dirt and gunpowder. "They used to say we couldn't stop those tanks," Rutledge mutters. Delaney leans back against the earth wall. "Yeah," he says. "They said a lot of things." The bazooka rests beside them like an old hunting dog, battered, muddy but dependable. The only sound is the wind pushing through the trees and the distant sound of more tanks somewhere, out there, waiting. But the Americans are ready, and they're not laughing anymore. The Rhine glistens under a gray sky, swollen with melted snow and weeks of rain. The river marks more than just a boundary. It's Hitler's last true barrier in the West. And now, the Allies have punched a hole through it. The Ludendorff Bridge, half destroyed and rigged with explosives, still stands against all odds, a blackened steel skeleton straddling the water. Days earlier, it was seized in a bold rush by the 9th Armored Division. Now, the Americans race to exploit it, ferrying tanks and troops across before the Germans can bring it down. But the enemy isn't finished yet, and their final answer is steel. From a ridge overlooking the bridge, a Tiger II idles under camouflage netting, its treads caked in mud. The crew is tense. Oberleutnant Dieter Falke, a seasoned commander of the 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion, stares through binoculars at the stream of American vehicles crossing into the heart of the Reich. He's lost too many men, too many tanks. but he still believes in the armor, in the beast. They're overextended, his gunner says. A clean flank shot will send them swimming. Falca nods. One shot, one well-placed blast. That's all it'll take to stop the advance, maybe buy time to collapse the bridge, maybe even stop the bleeding. He doesn't know that 500 yards ahead, in the shadows of the shattered riverbank, a man with a bazooka waits. Corporal Jack Delaney, his uniform wet and stiff with dried mud, crouches behind a pile of rubble. The bazooka rests across his knees, patched, taped, marked with scratches that map every battle since Omaha. He watches the tree line through a cracked artillery shell casing he's turned into a scope. There, he mutters. The Tiger II is crawling forward, pushing through debris like a bull through brush. Its turret swivels toward the bridge. And now, through the haze and smoke, Delaney sees it a clear flank. He waves to Private Rutledge, positioned 30 yards to his left, tucked behind a shattered bakery wall. Rutledge raises his launcher and waits. They don't speak. There's no time. Delaney exhales, rises. Whoosh! The rocket sails through the mist and strikes just above the drive sprocket. The Tiger jerks, halts, hisses steam, flames belch from its underside. But it doesn't die. Its turret snaps toward Delaney's position. "Move!" someone shouts. The 88mm cannon thunders. The shell slams into the rubble behind Delaney, blasting brick and mortar into the air. Dust rains down. His ears ring. He's thrown sideways but holds the bazooka. From the left flank, whoosh! Rutledge's shot. It slams into the turret base. This time, something gives. The Tiger erupts in a cone of orange light. Its commander is thrown clear, limbs limp, uniform aflame. The massive tank shudders and collapses into the trench it tried to cross. Delaney crawls forward and stares into the smoldering wreckage. The King Tiger lies dead, its pride buried under rubble and flame, and the bridge still stands. Later that night, in a field HQ lit by Coleman lamps, General William Hogue, commander of Combat Command B, 9th Armored Division, pins a commendation onto Delaney's jacket. "You saved the bridge," he says. Delaney, face dirty and eyes hollow, doesn't reply. He just nods. Outside, trucks and tanks rumble across the Ludendorff, their headlights sweeping over the river. The war is not over, but something fundamental has changed. Tigers, the pride of the Wehrmacht, are no longer gods of the battlefield, and the bazooka, the so-called Kinderspielzeug, has humbled them. Thousands of miles away, a final report lands on the desk of General Guderian in Berlin. His aides read aloud by candlelight. Field analysis confirms infantry carried anti-tank rocket launchers, M9 divided by M9A1, were directly responsible for the destruction or disabling of over 60% of armor casualties during retreat from Western Oro. Front sectors, including heavy armor units, recommend rapid development of countermeasures, though time may not allow. Guderian says nothing. Outside, the air raid sirens begin again. Inside, he closes the report and places it atop a stack of other warnings ignored too long, and in a final note, scrawled by hand in the margin, "Never underestimate a soldier with fire in his belly and a rocket on his shoulder. The war in Europe is over." In the ruins of towns, along the shattered highways of the Reich, and in fields now quiet for the first time in years, the echoes of steel treads and 88mm shells have been replaced by laughter, tears, and silence. Inside a sandbag-lined tent near the city of Reims, Corporal Jack Delaney sits on a folding chair, a mug of cold coffee in hand, watching his fellow soldiers file past a bulletin board tacked with the words, "Victory in Europe." He barely reacts. His bazooka rests in the corner, scarred by smoke, wrapped in twine, its sling frayed. It had no official name, no nickname carved in white paint. But it had been there in the hedgerows, in the mud of Hürtgen, beneath the frozen trees of the Ardennes, and along the banks of the Rhine. And it had done the unthinkable. In London, Paris, and New York, newspapers celebrate the triumph of Allied armor, the strength of the Sherman, the brilliance of Patton's speed. They show columns of tanks crossing bridges, aircraft thundering overhead. But in the small print of military briefings, in the sidebars of post-action reports, a truth is quietly acknowledged. The bazooka was the single most democratizing weapon in the infantry arsenal, allowing any foot soldier to challenge and destroy the mightiest tank in Hitler's army. In Berlin, deep within the bombed-out remains of the Reich Chancellery, Soviet soldiers sift through crates of abandoned German documents. One report, dated late March 1945, contains sketches of experimental countermeasures, side screens for Tigers, anti-rocket mesh, field-expedient flame screens. But the scribbled margin tells the real story. Too little, too late. Back in France, General Omar Bradley addresses a group of war correspondents. They laughed at it, he says, standing before a burned-out Panther marked with Allied chalk. The Germans mocked our bazooka as a child's weapon. But when it was in the right hands, used by the right man, it did something more than kill tanks. It killed their confidence. He walks along the side of the vehicle, the hole in its hull still visible, black and jagged. You want to know what won this war? Men like Delaney, Weaver, Rutledge, 100,000 infantrymen who believed that steel alone doesn't decide a battle. Courage does. Delaney doesn't return to the States right away. He stays in Europe as part of the occupation, helping clear roads and disarm booby traps in towns still half collapsed from artillery barrages. He doesn't talk much about the war. Most men don't. But when he finally ships home in the winter of '45, the only thing he carries with him aside from a photo of his squad and a duffel bag full of worn gear is the M9 Bazooka he never let go of. Customs tries to take it. He refuses. They let it pass. Decades later, the same launcher sits behind glass in a small county museum in Pennsylvania. A brass plate reads, M9 Bazooka Normandy to Remagen, carried by Corporal Jack Delaney, 2nd Infantry Division. Credited with the destruction of multiple German armored vehicles, including Tigers and Panthers. Donated by his family after his death in 1989. Children press their noses to the glass. Veterans nod quietly as they pass. Most don't speak, but some smile, because they remember. They remember the sound, the hiss and roar of defiance, the blur of fire streaking toward the beast, the silence that followed as smoke cleared and steel burned. In war, sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the loudest or the biggest or even the most expensive. Sometimes it's a 6-pound rocket fired by a 19-year-old who refuses to run. They called it a toy. It turned Tiger tanks into scrap.